we as sports fans want to see action similar to the way that we enjoy the games. And that is that when watching the sport, we enjoy the drama as it unfolds because we have no clue what's going to happen next. There's that element of surprise in every aspect of it. And the fact that we know these guys have been trained to execute these movements, these plays and everything, we want to see that type of action and that type of suspense portrayed on the screen. That's what's going to draw us in. Hello, and welcome to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Chasen, and like always, I'll be joined today by the great team that brings you cupofteacritiques.com. We are excited to get started on our podcast where we will share our perspectives on several areas in movies and television. At Cup of Tea Critiques, we review movie and television series and tag them with a tea brew that evokes a feel for the production. In this way, you can decide for yourself if they're your cup of tea. Here on the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast, we will dive even deeper into the productions and topics we broach on our website, engaging in conversation and sharing our unique perspectives. Ready for a deep look with a deep brew? This week's topic, sports movies. So let's get started. Cup of Tea Critiques is a family affair, and I'm here with my brother Chris, my mother Reba, and my father Terry. Let's start off with Chris. What would you call a sports movie?
Sports movie just has to have some element of the competition in it. I mean, it could be in the foreground, it could be in the background, but I think actual gameplay or actual competition on screen has to be part of the movie in a sense. Because otherwise we're talking about a movie where a character's an athlete could be called a sports movie, even if we never see him playing. So I just think I would just define a sports movie as just as movie. Even if there's other elements, there's got to be some athletic competition on screen.
Go ahead, Mom. What do you think?
I pretty much agree with Chris. I think a sports movie has to center athletic competition, and it has to be stiff competition because it has to engage the audience. There also has to be an element of heroism in it. That is, there has to be a victor at the end that has won over the audience at that point. I think those are the two huge elements it has to have.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too strict of a definition of that, other than the fact that, as both Chris and your mother said, that there has to be some sort of athletic competition going on. I think about some that have more of a comical aspect to them. Do they really have to be involved, or do they just have to have sports as a part of the story? So for me, as long as there's some bit of sports as part of the story and it's an integral part of the story, then it's probably a sports movie.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everybody here. One thing I'll say though is that I feel like sports competition in particular needs to be the setting, the backdrop for any of these productions. And I'll give a quick example because we understand that while Concussion is based on true story and had to deal with athletics and brain injuries and such, it didn't have the backdrop of sports competition. So that's why for myself, I do not put that in the category of a sports movie. So just to give a little bit of clarity on the differences there, for at least for my take anyways, on what would constitute that. Another thing, and I think Chris, you said this, it can't be just that one character is an athlete. It has to be a central theme in there. So like if we're watching, say, a movie where there's a kid in high school that's the high school quarterback, and they just so happen to show him practicing one time, that's not a sports movie. That's just a part of that character's backstory. So that's how I'll say there's a difference between a sports movie and just sports being a part of the production. That being said, I'll go back around the horn again. So now that we've kind of defined that, why don't you guys give us either like your favorite or what makes for a good sports movie in your eyes?
My favorite, I guess, I thought about this a long time, and I guess there are a lot of sports movies that I like a lot. I mean, I have a long laundry list, but Little Big League stuck out for me because I just like the joy of that whole story. So I think that would probably be my favorite. Followed as a close second is Love and Basketball. One, because basketball is close to my heart, and I like the how they included basketball being so important to the two main characters of the movie.
You asked me what was missing
What?
from basketball.
You woke me up to tell me that?
It's not fun for me anymore because you're missing. What I'm trying to say is, I've loved you since I was 11. And it won't go away.
Yeah, I agree with Terry. There are a number of sports movies that I like, and how much I like it depends on the sport. So, if it's a football movie, for example, well, it has to be hard-hitting football. And by hard-hitting, I mean, any given Sunday. And I know that movie had a lot of flaws in my view. But one thing it wasn't lacking is hard hitting. And so I like that movie for that reason, but I certainly wouldn't put it necessarily on my list of favorite sports movies. Among my favorites would include, in terms of kids' movies, would be Little Big League, probably my most favorite kids' sports movie there is. I also liked Sandlot a lot because I laughed an awful lot with that movie as well. And in terms of adult sports movies, I really like Jerry Maguire. It had enough of, I guess, hard-hitting football. It had a lot of humor. It had a good level of drama. I thought that was a very good film.
I got a lot. I think music and comedy are two elements that elevate a sports movie for me. So I think Remember the Titans has got to be up there. Mighty Ducks is for nostalgia would be up there. I say Little Big League is one of my favorites just because I think it's one of the funniest. And also I love the journey of how he takes over this team, and they initially reject him completely, and then by the end of the film there's a scene that's meant to be a comedic scene where the whole clubhouse is trying to help him solve this math problem so that they can go out and compete for their playoff game. And it's really just supposed to be a comedic scene, but it illustrates how far they've come in their relationship, that this whole locker room, this kid that they couldn't stand at first when he took over, now they're all trying to help him figure out this math problem. So I love it for just scenes like that.
If Joe can paint a house in 3 hours and Sam can paint the same house in 5 hours, how long does it take for them to do it together?
Wait a minute. You never said this was a word problem. Scales, get over here.
What's up, man?
If I can paint a house in 3 hours and you can paint it in 5, how long will it take us to paint it together? Lonnie!
And then a sleeper I would throw in there is Bring It On, because I thought that was it's just a funny teen comedy with some good acting, and they have athletic competition in there. They show them they show them in the midst of these athletic competitions, and I thought it was a pretty good, and the scene where the choreographer comes into the gym is one of the funniest scenes I've seen in a movie.
I am a choreographer. That's what I do. You are cheerleaders. Cheerleaders are dancers who have gone retarded. What you do is a tiny, pathetic subset of dancing. I will attempt to transform your robotic routines into poetry, written with the human body. Follow me, or perish, sweater monkeys.
Just laughing just thinking about it. So those would be my, I don't know if I said 4 or 5, but my top 5 minus 1 or top 5.
Yeah, if I were to add one more onto that, it would probably be Draft Day, because I thought it was an interesting look behind the scenes of what goes on Draft Day. I found that fascinating.
Those are all pretty awesome, and we all know I'm the resident sports nerd in this group, and so it's not hard to imagine that I have a very long list of sports movies I enjoy. So I'm going to try and keep it brief, just because otherwise I'd say yes. So anything made from 1982 to today that was a sports movie, yes, I think they're great. But all kidding aside, among the favorites, of course, I'm with everybody here. Little Big League, when that came out, being younger and just like imagining if I could have been in that role of actually taking over the team would have been fun. So for me, I think back on that feeling. Cool Runnings is absolutely hilarious, but I also love that it's a comedy with the backdrop of truth with it, talking about the Jamaican bobsled team. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
There's no better line than how about I draw a line down your head so it looks like a butt. So I love that in there. I'm going to also say Major League, I, I guess fortunate for everybody at that time when I was too young to really hear all the cuss words that were really going on. So the first time I saw it was on television where everything was bleeped out. And then when I got older, I got to enjoy it twice as much because I realized exactly all the things they really were saying. But just as a whole, it was a lot of fun. But I also enjoyed the journey of course, that the underdog story, a team that's terrible that all of a sudden got really good. But they also, for me, with that movie specifically, they do a great job of adding that drama at the end. Like, as much as they've turned their entire season around, here's their big game against their big nemesis, and they let that game be dramatic as well. So it was drama getting to that moment. It was drama getting through that moment, and that's why it's really high up at the top for me.
He's gonna try to score. Here comes the throw. He slides. He is.
I'll say The Program was also another one that I really enjoyed watching that. And with all of these, it has a lot to do with, they did a good job with the action on the field with trying to incorporate real life movements and stuff that it looked like real competition as opposed to something really crappy, just to be nice about it. So among everything, those are there. And then I'll give you another one that's really fun. And I also say, because I watched it around the time when I was still playing ball, is Summer Catch. Summer Catch was good. Jessica Biel was in there, and it was a lot of fun. Freddie Prinze Jr., Matthew Lillard, they were a lot of fun. It was dealing with, college ball during the summer and everything, which I could identify with at the time. Varsity Blues was another one, was when I was in high school for varsity football and everything. So those two I identified with because I was going through those exact sports in those settings at the same time that they were released. So that's why for me, those are the ones I really identify with and really enjoyed.
Brew. Time. What's up? What's going on? You okay?
I love her.
Oh. Okay. Well, I love her too. But let's get 2 more outs, okay? Come on, kid. Get up.
But Creed is my favorite movie, period, right now, the first Creed. And I know it's a boxing movie. I separated that out because it wasn't a team sport, but it is absolutely one of the best movies to me of all time. So, I do want to make sure I mention that in context of sports movies. It is a great movie. If you haven't checked it out, please do. And again, there's probably another 50 or 60 I could list, but I'm going to try and stop right there. Mm-hmm. Oh, special shout out, Necessary Roughness as well. Sinbad was freaking hilarious. So now that I've at least mentioned one movie from every year since I was born, we can also make this comment too. Unfortunately, as much as we've enjoyed all of these movies, we're noticing that there's a downward trend though in the number of productions on all of those. Mom, can you kind of speak to, what we're seeing and maybe give us a little hint as to why this seems to be happening?
Yeah. So from around the mid 90s to the early 2000s, we were seeing roughly, 3 to 4 sports movies theatrically released every year. And they were fun. They were hard hitting, and some of them were kids' movies, and they were just an awful lot of fun. And then we began to see a trend where the number of movies released began to go down from, say, 3 to 4 movies released every year to now going down to, say, 1 to 2 movies released a year. As a matter of fact, we're seeing more like 1 sports movie released every year. And so the question becomes, why are we seeing this downward trend in the release of sports movies? And so there are a number of reasons for that. One has to do with the cost of sports movies. As you can imagine, these are big budget films. And what we find is that they're not making a lot of this money back. One of the reasons they're not making this money back is because it costs a lot of money for them to use a franchise license. So, for example, if they want to use, say, the Chicago Bears or the Baltimore Ravens franchise tag for, say, a football movie, well, that costs an awful lot of money for them to do. Also, they need, say, big name stars in these movies in order to get the kind of draw that they want. And so the question became, well, is it worth it for them to even do these kinds of movies? When we read about these movies, we often see where they say these movies gross an awful lot of money. And so we're thinking that, these movies are making an awful lot of money because we see these big old numbers. But, as IMDb Pro reports, in order for these movies to make a profit, they need to make at least twice what it costs to make the film. And so while they may gross a lot, if they say, for example, a movie grossed $160 million, well, if that movie cost $80 million to make, then okay, $160 million makes sense. But it often costs a lot more than $160 million to make movies like this. And so a film needs to be 2x or twice its budget in order to make a profit. And now you add to this that franchises began to pull back on agreeing to license out their tags to make these movies. And so why did they begin to pull back on this? Well, we don't know. But now that those tags are not available, it took away from the authenticity of some of these films. And so those are some of the kinds of things that made it difficult to make these films again. And so what we're seeing now is a trend toward sports movies that focus more on individual sports. So you think about movies like Challengers, for example. Challengers focused on tennis. Well, that's an individual sport. We think about movies like The Long Game, focused on golf. Okay, that's an individual sport. And so it's a much smaller cast. It's a much smaller budget as a result. And so it's a lot easier for these films to make a profit. But even these films are not making a profit. Challengers, for example, made only 1.75x, which means it made only 75% of its budget. In other words, it didn't quite hit the 2x mark. Long Game, well below at 0.42x. So it didn't even make back its money. Shy of the 2x mark. And so it is very difficult for these sports films to make money.
You brought up a lot of interesting things there, one of which, just to make sure that we're clear with the audience, that a box office success, I want to make sure we get this right. Mom, we're saying it has to be 2x, which means it has to gross 2 times its budget, correct? That's what you're saying?
That is correct. It has to gross 2 times its budget. So a movie, let me just say this again. So a movie that, for example, costs $80 million to make needs to gross $160 million box office numbers in order to make its money back. So 2x is just a number to break even. That's just to break even. So the reason that 2x factor is so important is, and you may think that if a movie can just make its money back, that it should be fine, that anything beyond that amount means the movie was profitable. But what that doesn't account for is what it costs to distribute the film, what it costs to print the film, what it costs to advertise the film. And so it's all of those extra costs that add on to what it costs to make the film. And so that is where that 2x number comes in. So anything beyond that 2x or at 2 and above says that film was profitable. And let me just give you some examples of some movies that have done pretty well versus some movies that haven't. So if you think about the 2011 theatrical release Moneyball with Brad Pitt, it was 2.2x. And that particular movie used the Oakland A's franchise identity. So we can start, just with that, start making some relationship between the profitability of movies and their and how well those movies do financially. Another is Major League, which was incredibly popular. It was released in 1989, and I know I'm talking about some older movies here that starred Tom Berenger and Charlie Sheen, and it's Brandon's favorite movie, as he can attest to. They used the Cleveland Indians franchise, and it made 4.5x its budget. So that movie was hugely, hugely, hugely popular. And let me give you another one. The Blind Side, which dealt with sports. I mean, it was not purely sports, but sports was centered in it quite a bit. That was Sandra Bullock's movie along with Quentin Aaron. That was 10.6 times. And that used the Baltimore Ravens identity along with a bunch of SEC universities like LSU, then SEC universities. That landscape has changed so much, I don't know who's in what. But as LSU, Mississippi, and Tennessee, those identities were also used in that movie. So my point is that above 2 is good, and all of those movies were above 2, and they all had professional franchises or very well-known school franchises associated with them. Now add to that, Any Given Sunday didn't do as well, and it had a fake franchise associated with it. Trouble with the Curve, interestingly enough, used the Atlanta Brave franchise, and it was 1.6x. So while that professional franchise does not guarantee profitability, it increases the chances that a film will be profitable. So I just wanted to, throw those in there.
Those are some good points, Mom. Chris, I'm going to kick it to you too in a moment. But I think what's interesting with those numbers and those specific call outs are that you mentioned movies that had a lot of big name stars in there. I'm going to specifically talk about what I think is different between Trouble with the Curve and Moneyball, because those both were baseball movies, but they had baseball as a backdrop, but there wasn't a ton of action involved in both of those. However, what I think is different and why we're seeing the difference in outcome for those two in terms of being called a box office success is while we got great acting and everything with Trouble with the Curve, there wasn't much action involved. There wasn't much suspense involved. It was just a dramatic film. And in the realm of sports, when there's drama, but no drama in terms of the physical action on the field or whatever, I think that's why as a sports movie, it came up short in that regard. Comparatively speaking, Moneyball was a bit biographical as well. It told of an actual situation that already occurred. We knew about how the Oakland A's managed to, with a budget, turn into a competitive franchise. And I think people enjoyed the kind of behind the scenes look with superstars, but behind the scenes look on how we got there and everything. And that's where I think the drama and the fun was different. There was some action on the field in both movies, but overall, I think that speaks to why Moneyball ended up being a success, despite being a dramatic film as well, like Trouble with the Curve. And that's where Trouble with the Curve, unfortunately, with this, in terms of this standing, how it came up short. And so with that in mind, it's funny to think of that because there's so many of these movies that we really did enjoy, and then it turns out that we may have enjoyed them, but they came up short. For the whole panel here, let's ask this around. What do you think? Why do you think, or what do you think is keeping these movies from coming up short of becoming a box office success in your own opinion?
Some of it may be the fact that a lot of movies on sports are more centered on sports that are popular in the U.S. versus worldwide. And I know we're going to get into this a little later, but yeah, I think typically it's the fact that maybe they don't have as broad of an appeal as you might think they would.
I would add to that. I think a big chunk of successful sports movies and the appeal of them is the kind of coming of age element. If you look back in the mid 90s or even the early 2000s, and we talked about kind of franchising and licensing with professional sports franchises, but I also think, a lot of these sports movies are teen, they're teen comedies, teen dramas, and kids dramas. When you see the top 5 grossing sports movies from 1994, 3 of them are kids movies. It's Mighty Ducks 2, Little Giants, and Angels in the Outfield, 3 of the top 5. And I wonder if kids coming up now, youth sports is not as popular as it was, and I think kids spend their time a little differently now. their entertainment is a little different. They don't go outside as much. They're plugged in all the time. They're kind of online a lot. And so I wonder if these coming of age movies even have the same appeal to them. I feel like kids movies now are more based in fantasy. And so I think that in that sense they might have just lost their appeal.
Yeah, for myself, we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but Mom, you brought up the licensing. Chris, you just brought up the licensing, and I do think that those do play a major role in it, in part because um, one thing with fandoms is it's a part of our identity. And so, when you say you're a Bulls fan, you're all about, the garb you're wearing, you follow that team closely. And so one aspect of it is when we're watching these sports movies and the licenses, they're not using the real franchises. That's one thing that's not helping us be drawn in to wanting to watch this, specifically when we're talking about professional sports. Comparatively speaking, when you're talking about lower levels, for example, high school, I brought up Varsity Blues earlier. That one was considered a box office success. And I think in part because we don't have to worry about licensing in that case. It's high school, so everybody can identify with the level and just kind of run with it. And it was entertaining for what it was. It was a high school sports movie as compared to, fans of professional sports going, that's not really my franchise out there. Like the Miami Sharks, for example, in Any Given Sunday. While that's a really awesome name for a franchise, it doesn't exist. So it didn't necessarily pull any audience given that it wasn't professional and everything like that. So that's among the reasons for myself. A second one, and one that I think is really high up there, and this is why I said I enjoy a lot of my other movies, is that we as sports fans want to see action similar to the way that we enjoy the games. And that is that when watching the sport, we enjoy the drama as it unfolds because we have no clue what's going to happen next. There's that element of surprise in every aspect of it. And the fact that we know these guys have been trained to execute these movements, these plays and everything, we want to see that type of action and that type of suspense portrayed on the screen. That's what's going to draw us in. And it's not lost on me that when you're talking about a movie becoming a box office success, a lot of that is dependent on repeat dollars, people that want to come back to the theater to see this again. If we don't have those kind of aspects in it, those elements involved, you're only likely to watch it one time before going, even considering to see it again. So I think those are the big things that play a role in whether or not a movie becomes a box office success, particularly we're talking about if a sports movie becomes one. Mom, do you have anything? Oh, sorry, Chris, it looks like you wanted to say something.
I'm going to jump in. Also, another thing, I feel like people are getting their fill through sports documentaries that are just premiering on streaming. I think when sports movies were a little bit more popular, we didn't have as much access to athletes as we do now. So you're seeing streaming shows about either sports scandals or about just a day in the life of kind of stuff where you get to follow a wide receiver as he shows up to the facility on an off day to watch film or do a scrimmage or something like that. You get to hear talking heads from coaches, assistant coaches, strength coaches, or whatever the case may be. You get to hear sideline conversations. You get to hear on field or on court conversations. So people are getting their fix that way more so than a fictional, drama.
That's an excellent point, Chris. As a big sports fan, I agree with that. I mean, NFL Films has brought the drama of NFL games to life for a lot of fans, myself included. And so I think as a regular sports fan, we are gravitating more towards something like that. And even a movie I didn't mention as one of my favorites, but it speaks to exactly your point, is Michael Jordan Come Fly With Me, which came out in the very beginning of the 90s. Like any kid from Chicago at that time, you got the greatest athlete of all time in your city, and then they made this movie. It's on VHS. I'm sure I can go order it on Blu-ray if I can't find it on streaming, but I loved every bit of that because it brought me closer to my favorite athlete. So you're right. When it comes to sports fans, especially in sports movies, the documentaries are probably where we're being drawn into more. So, Mom, did you have something there?
Yeah, I think two questions I think it raises here is one, are people getting their fill from documentaries, television documentaries, because of the absence of sports movies, theatrically released sports movies? That's one. And the other is, we are in a different era than we were in the 1990s and early 2000s when we didn't have streaming. To you guys' point, we do have streaming available to us now. So we can watch, just about anything from the convenience of our home. And I think generally when people have the option to do that, they will. But I have to say, I just can't help but feel that if there is just, a really great, sports movie at the theaters, I find it hard to believe that people wouldn't be motivated to go see that. As a matter of fact, we're beginning to see the trailer for F1, Formula One, which is Jerry Bruckheimer's new film that's supposed to come out in June, starring Brad Pitt and Damson Idris about Formula One. And so, of course, it's going to be theatrically released, and it is expected to be just a huge, huge blockbuster film. And, of course, Bruckheimer in the studio is, betting on that. And so I can't wait to see just what is this going to look like? Are people going to, run to the theaters to see this film? And I think that's going to tell us something about people's appetites for theatrically released movies like this. So are people watching streaming because of the absence of movies like this? This will tell Hollywood something, I think.
That's an excellent point, Mom. I'm looking forward to finding that out, and I'm looking forward to this movie as well. It's interesting. As a team sports guy, I will say this is much more of an individual sport, but it's also given me a look at the action differently than trying to watch people racing in a circle for several hours. This makes it just much more up close and personal and fun, and I hope they can give us the same type of action that draws those racing fans in. It's going to at least bring me in, I could say, for myself. One more thing I want to touch on this as we're talking about why these are not necessarily hitting box office success rates. We are also noticing kind of like a cultural difference between where these movies are being successful, depending on the style and what sport we're also featuring. Dad, I'm going to go ahead and kick it to you first here because you brought this up earlier. So why don't I just go ahead and let you take the mic and run with it? What are you seeing?
Some movies, depending on the sport, has more of a worldwide appeal. And so, just to mention a couple, we looked at Invictus, which dealt with rugby, and it was like 3.25 times more money worldwide than it did in the U.S. and Canadian release of the movie. So that, and for instance, Cool Runnings was like 2.25 times more. And Cool Runnings dealt more with the Olympics.
Now look in the mirror and tell me what you see.
I see Junior.
You see Junior. Well, you want to know what I see? I see pride. I see power. I see a badass mother who don't take no crap of nobody.
You really see all that?
Yeah, man. But it's not about what I see. It's about what you see.
So some sports movies that have more of a worldwide appeal are more successful by that number that we were talking about of at least making 2.5 times whatever its budget was. And I guess I can bring one more up. The one that Chris brought up was Green Street Hooligans, which really clobbered its U.S. and Canadian dollars amount by 10. So it was 10 times more quote unquote successful than its US release.
West Ham football's mediocre, but our firm is top notch and everyone knows it. The GSE, Green Street Elite. Arsenal, great football, shit firm. The Gooners. Tottenham, shit football and a shit firm. The Yids they're called.
Yeah, just that the how ingrained the sport is in the culture, I think, just makes a big difference. I mean, I think we kind of discussed, like, in certain societies, rugby is very popular. In certain societies, soccer is very popular. And you think of, cricket, you think of movies that are, just, it's not even just that people are exposed to them. It's just that it's what kids play growing up, or it's what kids watch growing up, or the athletes that they gravitate towards. I think that can influence what you choose to watch. And so I think you see that with the kind of some of the differences in how a movie does in certain parts of the world. So yeah, I mean that's what I would say in terms of cultural relevance.
I wanna bring this home with one more question for you guys though. Like, despite the downward trend and everything, we're talking about certain elements that are missing, but we're also seeing an uptick in the documentary. So my question to the panel as we close things out is: do you think we are going to see an increase in sports movie productions making their way back to the box office in the future?
I hope so. I really hope so, because when you guys were growing up, we went to the theater to see quite a few sports movies, and we enjoyed them. We enjoyed them very, very much. And I don't think our appetites have changed for that. Even though streaming has come along and made things quite convenient for us to see almost anything we want, in the home, I think I can speak for all of us, we enjoy going to the movies. We still enjoy going to the movies. And I would love to see a good sports movie on screen. I certainly plan to go check out F1, Jerry Bruckheimer, just so you know. I certainly plan to check out F1. And I am looking forward to seeing, how many people clamor to the theaters to check it out, and hope that catalyzes the industry to make more films like this. Add to that the professional sports leagues are now feeling a little more amenable to licensing their brands to the industry. Much more so than they have over the last, say, 20 years. That could open the doors. That could open the doors to the industry, doing these films again.
Yeah, I agree. I only went through a very short list of the movies, sports movies that I like. Again, I could list, if I kept going, it could probably easily hit 100. And for various reasons, but more so because, as we always go back to when we talk about movies, some of it is the story. And part of that story, as you brought up, is, the big stop, or the big score or whatever. And I look forward to seeing things like that. I'm a lover of IMAX, and I think that that's just perfect for things like this. Matter of fact, I'm thinking maybe even seeing F1 on an IMAX. But yeah, I certainly hope that we do have more sports stories in the future, and that they're big splashes where you can see them in all their glory on a large screen.
I hope we do. I'm on board with everybody on that. I'm skeptical that we will. I feel like something else would have to give way to that. Like something else would have to experience a decline for sports movies to step in. And I honestly feel though like a big part of the success of sports movies was having something that your kid would be interested in going to see with you. And so when I feel like having kids movies, having teen movies, that was a big piece of the pie. And so, even though sports franchises are more willing to attach their name to these movies, I feel like the real, the meat of it is still, youth, youth sports or youth culture, teenagers. I feel like the story being centered around them is what would give what would give films greater earning potential. And I'm struggling to think of star, actors around that age that would really do that. I think about how old Freddie Prinze Jr. and Jessica Biel and Matthew Lillard were when Summer Catch came out. They're probably older than what they were playing, but I think I'm just struggling to think of stars that in that age range that they would cast that would be like, oh, I'm gonna go see that. The way you might have back then. So, in terms of the formula for success, being, a big name draw, And some of the other things Bruckheimer mentioned, I just don't know if we're actually going to get those. I think licensing is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point on that one in terms of young stars, but this is prime opportunity for something like that. I remember Winter's Bone. Yeah, I mean, who was Jennifer Lawrence, and she emerged as a star in that.
If Dad has done wrong, Dad has paid. And whoever killed him, I don't need to know all that. But I can't forever carry them kids. And my mom. Not without that house.
So this seems like a prime opportunity for someone to get pushed forward in that respect. To your point about someone young being able to fill that spot.
Yeah, I think I agree with your dad. I think, we are advocates of indie film. We are big advocates of indie film. And an element of indie film is, making a space for newcomers to strut their stuff. And so I think there's plenty of room to bring them in and let them do it doesn't have to be summer catch, but a summer catch like film that would be quite entertaining and draw in young people. I can easily see something like that being made and drawing people into the theaters. So I'm not as pessimistic as Chris on this one. Not as pessimistic as Chris on this one. I remain hopeful. As for the big ones, as for the big movies, I agree with Bruckheimer. Unfortunately, I've heard that before, that it just requires big name actors to really pull them over. As for these big movies, I do agree with, I hate to say it, but I do agree that may be a requirement for those.
I feel exactly like the rest of you guys, that I'm hopeful that they do make him back to the theaters, because there's just, I remember the feelings I had watching The Sandlot on the big screen, watching Mighty Ducks on the big screen. And we're talking about kids' movies in particular. And I'm doing so intentionally because I'm wondering, what I'm noticing is that F1 is coming out this year. Gran Turismo recently came out. We just talked about Draft Day. So we are seeing, movies make their way to the screen again and getting, big releases and such. And I know Gran Turismo was based off of a video game, but the action sequences, all of that was based off of also the idea of the kid playing the game and then turning it into an actual racing career. I say all this to say that as we're speaking right now, I have in my head this awesome idea of being able to sit down in the theater, and they have these new screens are coming out, the widescreen scenes that have the extra space on the side walls as well now, and seeing something like based off of the Little League World Series. And I think it'd be really cool to kind of see the way that the action would unfold, but the drama unfold, letting the kids run the show with it as well. It doesn't have to be like heavy, but I think if we had an opportunity for that for the kids and even for the adults to have a chance to see movies like that, that's what would be really awesome. And there's no other place for it than on a big screen. It'd be really nice to see those returns. So I'm hopeful that we'll see that in the future. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. Thanks so much for listening and figuring out your cup of tea along with us. Honestly, we could go on and on like we do at our dinner table, as mentioned with the 6 million other movies that we did not say by name. But we do look forward to you joining us again next week on another great discussion. Make sure you rate and follow the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And be sure to shout out your favorite sports team and movie in the comments in this episode. You can stay in the loop on all things COTC by subscribing on our website at cupofteacritiques.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Check out our Instagram at Cup of Tea Critiques and on Letterboxd at COT Critiques. For Reba, Terry, and Chris, I'm Brandon. We'll see you next week for another deep look with a deep brew.